Good evening. It's 8 o'clock in Yerushalayim. This is WebYeshiva.org, and it's time to begin our regular halachic. This is part of a series. This is part of a series leading up to Leil HaSeder for Pesach, and I was given the topic of Marror, which is one of the simanim in Leil HaSeder, and when I was given this topic to talk about, I asked how many weeks I could devote to this. It seemed to me that to completely cover the topic of Marror would require at least 10 sessions. But they gave me just one session and said, choose a few issues that you want to deal with. So here goes. If you have any questions during the class, feel free to type your questions and I'll see them on chat, and I can incorporate the answers into the ongoing shiur. Now, the whole issue of maror, bitter herbs, in Leil HaSeder begins in the Gemara. Well, of course, someone like me who views the Gemara as being the source of all halacha, of course, I begin with the Gemara, and I'm not going to bother telling you the exact page number because you have that on the screen. As with all the sources which I'm going to present, you have the exact sources. You can look up the original text to see my typing errors because I don't type very well. Amar Rava. Rava says in the Gemara, matzah bisman hazeh, nowadays means after the destruction of the temple, after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, when we no longer have korbanot. Nowadays, we no longer have the sacrificial order. Nowadays, matzah is still deraisa. It's still a Torah mitzvah to eat matzah in Leil HaSeder. But maror is only derabanan. In the days when the Beis HaMikdash was standing, maror was a Torah commandment as part of Leil HaSeder. Nowadays, it's only derabanan, only a rabbinic requirement. Maishna maror. What's the difference between maror and matzah? Why does matzah remain a Torah commandment while maror has been demoted from a Torah commandment to a mere rabbinic commandment? Why? What's the difference? Dichtiv. It says in the verse, Al matzot u'marorim yochluhu. The verse in the Torah seems to relate to matzah and maror equally. If the verse in the Torah relates to them equally, then why should there be a difference in the status between the mitzvahs? The answer, bisman de'ika pesach, if you're eating the korban pesach, the sacrificial lamb, which they had back in those days, yesh maror, then maror is a Torah commandment. The Torah commandment is to eat the maror with the korban pesach, with the sacrificial lamb. Bisman deleka pesach, nowadays we don't have the korban pesach, the sacrificial lamb, like a maror, so we don't have a Torah commandment to eat maror. So of course, we're left with a rabbinic commandment, and this opens up a very important question, which I'm just going to deal with briefly. Everyone knows that among the 613 commandments of the Torah, everyone knows that one of the 613 commandments is it's prohibited to add any new commandment. That's well known. And behold, we just have an example on the screen before us of the rabbis in the post-temple period legislating a new mitzvah. Now there is no Torah mitzvah of eating maror in Leil HaSeder. Nonetheless, the rabbis command us to do it. Are they not in violation of creating a new mitzvah, namely eating maror even without the korban pesach? Well, the underlying response to this question, the underlying solution, is a basic idea. And indeed, Chazal the great rabbis of the Mishnah, Gemara, through the generations, indeed, the great rabbis do not have the authority to introduce any new commandment. And if they would do so, heaven forbid, they would be in violation of the prohibition of adding a new mitzvah to the Torah. Therefore, every halacha which is of rabbinic origin, like the one we have before us now, every halacha which is of rabbinic origin, in order to be legitimate, must be the fulfillment of one of the 613 real commandments. In this particular case, the understanding is very simple, straightforward. One of the 613 commandments is Mora HaMikdash. Let's get that spelled correctly on chat. Mora HaMikdash, awe of the Beit HaMikdash, a sense of awe of the Beit HaMikdash is one of the 613 commandments, which has thousands of details to it. You have to station guards outside. You have to take your shoes off before you go in. There are thousands of details to this halacha. And Zecher LeMikdash, remembering the Mikdash, thinking about the temple in Jerusalem, remembering it, talking about it, that's part of the Torah commandment of Mora HaMikdash, awe of the Beis HaMikdash, awe of the temple, and eating Mora B'zman Hazeh reminds us of the sacrificial order in the Beis HaMikdash, and therefore does indeed fulfill the mitzvah of Mora HaMikdash. In any event, let's see if we can make sure that this Gemara that we just looked at is indeed embraced by the subsequent generations of rabbis. After all, just because we have a lovely passage in the Gemara which leads to some conclusions does not necessarily mean that that is the definitive halacha. Maybe there are other passages elsewhere in rabbinic literature which the subsequent generations embraced. Rambam says, "Achilat maror eina mitzvah min haTorah b'fnei atzma." Eating maror is not an independent mitzvah of the Torah, ela tluya b'achilas matzah, b'achilas Pesach. The mitzvah of eating maror is totally dependent on and part of the mitzvah of the paschal lamb, the sacrificial lamb. Mitzvahs aseh achas le'echol b'sar ha'pesach al matzahs u'marorim. One of the 613 commandments is to eat matzah and maror together with the korban pesach. There's a separate mitzvah, which we're not going to talk about tonight, to eat matzah independently. For maror, the mitzvah min haTorah is only with the korban pesach. Midivrei sofrim, the rabbis came along and said, le'echol maror levado. The rabbis legislated and created a new obligation to eat maror on the night of Leil HaSeder, even if you're not eating the sacrificial lamb. Okay. Now, I said before that the justification for the mitzvah, what enabled the rabbis to command us to eat maror, is that it's a way of remembering, a way of focusing the attention. It's a way of thinking about the Beis HaMikdash, and therefore falls under the rubric of Mora HaMikdash, awe of the Mikdash. Well, let's see a quick proof for that idea. Just because I have a lovely idea doesn't mean that it's necessarily justified. We want a source for the idea. Mitzvat maror min haTorah eina ela b'zman she'pesach ne'achal. I'm quoting the Shulchan Aruch Harav. For better or worse, that's a complicated way of saying, unfortunately, there are two great Sforim, two great books with exactly the same name. There's the Shulchan Aruch, written by Rabbi Yosef Karo, which is the Shulchan Aruch, and then there's the Shulchan Aruch, written by the Baal HaTanya, the first Lubavitcher Rebbe that we're about to quote from, which is also the Shulchan Aruch. Well, this is potentially very confusing, and therefore, in Chabad circles, in Lubavitch circles, this book is called the Shulchan Aruch of the Baal HaTanya. Outside of Chabad circles, exactly the same sefer is called Shulchan Aruch Harav, the Shulchan Aruch of the Great Rabbi, and even outside of Hasidic circles, even outside of Chabad circles, this sefer, the Shulchan Aruch Harav, has vast influence, quoted on virtually every page of the Mishnah Brura, for example. Well, let's see what he says. We know that nowadays there's no Torah mitzvah of Marror. The reason it's of Torah status only in the days of the Beis Hamikdash is because of the verse. B'chodesh hasheni b'arba asayom ben arabayim yasu otam matzos u'mararam yochluhu. The verse in the Torah clearly combines Korban Pesach together with eating the Maror. Bisman hazeh, nowadays, eating Maror is only d'Rabbanan, shetiknu zeicher lemikdash. They gave us this rabbinic commandment in order to fulfill the Torah commandment of zeicher lemikdash. Aval chil v'achilas matzah, as far as matzah is concerned, even nowadays it's a Torah mitzvah, as we have in a separate verse. Barishon ba'arba'asa yom lechodesh ba'erev tochlu matzos. We have a separate verse which is totally independent of the Beis Hamikdash, totally independent of the korban, having nothing to do with the sacrificial lamb, a separate verse commanding us to eat matzot on the first night of Pesach. So that's min haTorah, that's of Torah status even nowadays. Okay, that's the background. Now let's get into the details because we want to fulfill the rabbinic commandment correctly. Now I'm quoting from the other Shulchan Aruch, the Shulchan Aruch of Rav Yosef Karo. The beginning of the 17th century, not true, beginning of the 16th century, from Tzfat in the Upper Galilee. Yikach kezayet maror v'yeshkenu kulo b'charosis. You take a kezayet of maror, that's a measure, a certain volume of maror. Well, what is the volume? It's the volume of an olive, but of course, rabbis who can argue about anything are happy to argue about what the volume of an olive is. You know, you can have two rabbis sitting at a wood table, and they can argue about which direction the grain is in the wood. Remember that the mitzvah of Maror is d'Rabbanan, and therefore there's less reason to be strict, unlike matzah, which is a Torah commandment, and therefore has more reason for a strict interpretation. Reb Chaim of Volozhin, one of the all-time great rabbis, he came to the conclusion that the volume, the measure of a kazayit is around 5 cubic centimeters. Now, I just unscrewed the top of a maize soda water bottle, an ordinary plastic cap from an Israeli. So that's 5 cubic centimeters. That's the amount of maror required according to Reb Chaim of Volozhin. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, one of the all-time great rabbis and surely one of the big names of the 20th century, was asked, is it okay for an elderly person is it okay for an elderly person or a sick person or someone who has difficulty eating? Is it okay for someone who is sick or elderly or whatever the problem is, has difficulty eating? Is it okay to rely upon such a small measure of maror? To which Rav Shlomo Zalman responded, well, yes, of course, that's satisfactory. But not only an elderly person, not only a sick person, anyone could rely upon that opinion. After all, it is one of the valid opinions amongst the rabbis. And then Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach told the following story. Once the Avnei Nezer, the Sachatshava Rav, the Borman Rabbi, the family name was Borman, but that's not well known in the Torah world. The Avnei Nezer, the greatest of the Hasidic and the greatest of the poskim in late 19th century Poland, once distributed little pieces of lekach, little pieces of cake to the Hasidim. And then he commanded the Hasidim, Machta Bruche, pronounce a blessing on this little piece of cake I have distributed to you and eat it, which they did. And then the rabbi says to the Hasidim, now make a bracha for after eating, alamichia. One of the Hasidim was sufficiently brazen, sufficiently cheeky, that he said, but Rebbe, is it proper to make a bracha alamichia on such a small measure, such a tiny piece of cake? To which the Avnei Nezer responded, have you never seen an olive? Don't you know how big an olive is? That's the minimum size of the shiur. So that's okay. Of course, if you're able to, it's of course commendable, of course it's praiseworthy, of course it's a good idea to be stricter than the minimum opinion of Reb Chaim of Volozhin and Avnei Nezer and Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. Of course, if you can fulfill the mitzvah by eating more maror, and therefore fulfill the mitzvah according to more opinions, that's good. The most common opinion out there is that of Rav Avram Chaim Noeg. Rav Avram Chaim Noeg, he was one of the big names in the middle of the 20th century, and he came to the conclusion that a kazayat, the volume of an olive, is not 5 cubic centimeters, like Reb Chaim of Volozhin said, but rather 27 cubic centimeters, 27 cubic centimeters, and therefore that's the volume of maror you need. I have an ordinary box of Israeli matches, 30 cubic centimeters. Reb Avram Chaim Noe said 27. This is 30, a little bit more than the minimum, and that, the opinion of Reb Avram Chaim Noe, is by far, the most widely spread, by far, the most commonly embraced opinion. So we're not talking about a huge amount of maror here. You take the maror and you dip it entirely, you immerse it entirely in charoset. You immerse it entirely in charoset, and of course, it says here in Hebrew. I don't know if you can read it. I'll read it to you. It says here in Hebrew on this Israeli box of matches, harhek me'esh. Don't let a match come anywhere near fire. You know, I don't know how you're supposed to use them, but and there's even a picture on the other side of a burning match. So in any event, according to the Shulchan Aruch, you totally immerse the maror in charoset. I hope someone else in this series is going to be talking about recipes for charoset. If not, you can get online different recipes for charoset. Lo yeshena b'tochel, but after you've immersed the maror in the charoset, you don't leave it there. Shelo yevatel tam mariris, because the charosis has a flavor, has a taste, and when you come to eat maror, you're supposed to experience only the taste of the maror while you are chewing and swallowing the maror, and you don't want it to mix with the taste of the charosis in which you just dipped the maror. Metam zeh, for this reason, tzarich lina'er hacharoset me'elav. For this reason, correct, as you point out on chat, for this reason, after you've immersed the the Marror in the charosis, you should shake it off so that you don't actually have charosis when you're chewing and swallowing the Marror. You make a bracha al achilas Marror. It's correct to make a bracha on rabbinic mitzvahs. Then you eat it without reclining. You don't need reclining for this mitzvah. That's the text of the Shulchan Aruch. Now, of course, there are commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch. Well, let's survey the principal commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch, on the passage we just looked at. First, the Ber Heitev, at the bottom of the page. Yeah, romaine lettuce is fine. You can in the Ber Heitev at the bottom of the page, he says, "Ein lishrot hamoror me'et le'et b'mayim dekavushu." Be sure that when you're preparing the Marror for Seder night, you do not soak it in water for a period of 24 hours or longer. The rule is as follows: kavush kimavushal. I'll spell that out, chat. Kavush kimavushal. Pickling has halachically the same status as cooking. It deserves a whole shiur by itself, why that's true, but the minimum definition of pickling is leaving a substance, leaving food in a bath of any liquid for 24 hours or longer, and therefore, if the Marror has sat wet for 24 hours or longer, it now has the halachic status of being kavush, pickled, and therefore that's the same as the halachic status as being cooked, and therefore no longer valid for Leil HaSeder. Bottom line, resist the temptation to soak your Marror in water for 24 hours or longer prior to the Seder night. The Olat Shabbat says, Hatam de'enu mevarech al charoset mishum du tefel l'Marror. The charoset is not a mitzvah at all. It's just a small detail of the mitzvah of Marror. The mitzvah is the mitzvah of Marror. And the charoset has no independent status as a mitzvah at all. Therefore, no bracha on the charosis. The Mishnah Brura says, Yesh mekomot she'ein nohagim l'shakea kulo ela b'tibul mitzasa. I cannot count the number of times people have told me that Torah-observant Jews do everything which is in the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch governs the life of Torah-observant Jews. I can't count the number of times people have told me this. But the truth is, there's not a single line in the whole of the Shulchan Aruch which is not subject to controversy and diverse and opposing opinions. In this case, the Mishnah Brura, and surely there's no more influential halachic work than the Mishnah Brura in the early 20th century. Mishnah Brura says, Shulchan Aruch says you immerse the Marror in the charoset. Yesh mekomot she'eino nohagim. We don't do that. Well, we don't follow what it says in the Shulchan Aruch. We just dip the charosis a little bit. We just dip the Marror a little bit in the charosis. We don't submerge it. We do not immerse it entirely like the Shulchan Aruch says. And we just do a little bit of dipping, and that's all. Mishnah Brura also says, according to the Shulchan Aruch, you're not allowed to do the reclining business for Marror. I disagree with that also. After all, the reason the Shulchan Aruch said that is because eating Marror is a zecher la'avdus, to remember the enslavement in Egypt, and therefore you should sit upright like a slave does when a slave eats. Makom, however, if you want to lean back, lean. You want to lean. You don't want to lean, don't lean. Even though the Shulchan Aruch said it's a no-no to eat reclining, Mishnah Brura says, do whatever you want. It really doesn't matter. Well, in the space of 4 words in the Shulchan Aruch, the Mishnah Brura has rejected the opinion of the Mishnah Brura, has rejected the opinion of Shulchan Aruch twice. Take this as a tipasha b'yam, a drop in the bucket, the tiniest example of millions untold opinions of the poskim who are unhappy with this in the Shulchan Aruch or reject that in the Shulchan Aruch and so forth and so on. Okay, now this brings us to the discussion of charosis, charosit. The origin of charosit is in the Mishnah. Af al pi she'ein charosis mitzvah. The Mishnah so often just assumes that you know all about a subject matter, and the Mishnah just adds some little detail. And of course, one wonders where you're supposed to learn about the whole topic. The Mishnah just assumes you know about it. For example, I'll give you an example of what I mean. You'll understand right away. The Mishnah asks the question, what kind of oil are you allowed to use when you light Shabbos candles? What kind of wicks are you allowed to use when you light Shabbos candles? And the Mishnah goes on for lengthy discussions, which the rabbis discuss endlessly through the generations. Neither the Mishnah nor any other Talmudic source ever discussed the obligation to light Shabbos candles. The Mishnah just assumes that you know about that and begins discussing the smallest details. Well, here as well. The Mishnah just assumes that you know all about charosis and begins with a little detail mentioning, charosis is not a mitzvah. We understand why, because we learned 2 screens ago that it's just part of the mitzvah of Marror. The ilav mitzvah, mishum mai ma'isile. If charosis is not a mitzvah, why do we bother with it? Why does Marror need charosis? Amar Rav Ami. Rav Ami answers, mishum kappa. The reason we need charosis as part of the mitzvah of Marror is because of kappa. What on earth is kappa? Rashi says kappa is sraf hachazeret. It's the sraf of the Marror. V'yesh po eres, and there's some poison in the sraf of the Marror. What on earth is sraf? I mean, I didn't know the meaning of the word kappa in the Gemara. Rashi explains by saying it's sraf. But what is sraf? How does that help? There's sort of like beginners who use a bilingual dictionary to look up the meaning of this Hebrew word or that Hebrew word, and you don't understand the English translation of it either. Well, here Rashi's done a good job of confusing us by defining kappa as sraf. Now, the word sraf in Hebrew, I have a big dictionary, which I looked up the meaning of the word sraf in a big Hebrew dictionary, and I found that the word has 2 meanings. First of all, the sraf is a kind of liquid which oozes out of a plant. That's called a resin in English. But the same word sraf can also mean an insect, a noxious, a harmful insect, or even a snake, as in the Torah verse, V'yishalach Hashem ba'am nechashim hasrafim. Kadosh Baruch Hu sent these noxious animals in a plague. Well, the word sraf has 2 meanings. Which meaning did Rashi mean? Did he mean that there's a resin, which is poisonous, that oozes out of the Marror? Or did he mean that there's an insect, a worm or something, which is noxious, which is poisonous in the Marror? Which did he mean? Well, let's see the opinions of the poskim. He had a grandson. Rashi's grandson was the Rashbam. And the Rashbam, the grandson's generation, grandson of the Rambam, he was one of the founders of the Beit Midrash of the Tosafot. Right? It's the grandchildren of Rashi who founded the Tosafot, and he was one of them. And he explains as follows: what is this sraf? What is this poison in the marrow? Rabbeinu Hananel, Rabbeinu Hananel, he quotes Rabbeinu Hananel. Rabbeinu Hananel was a big name back in the early Middle Ages. Rabbeinu Hananel was the primary link between the Gaonim in Babylonia after the Talmudic period, after the editing of the Talmud was done and the text of the Talmud was sealed. The great yeshivas in Babylonia did not stop functioning. They continued into the Middle Ages, and the heads of the yeshivas were called the Gaonim. And they were the rabbis who carried the traditions of the Talmudic rabbis in Babylonia. Well, eventually Jewish populations in the world shifted to Italy, to France, to Germany, to North Africa, to Spain, and eventually the centers of Limud, the centers of Torah study, moved from Babylonia to North Africa, Spain, to Italy, France, Germany, and so forth and so on. And Rabbeinu Hananel, he was the one who brought the Gaonic traditions from Babylonia to North Africa. And he was therefore largely responsible for igniting the Torah learning in North Africa, which eventually moved into Spain. In any event, the Rabbeinu Hananel says as follows: Kappa, the whole problem with Marror is tola'at, is a worm which is in the Marror. And a proof for this is in the Mishnah. The Mishnah talks about tola'im shebe'ikre ha'ilanot. The Mishnah talks about worms which are in the trunks of trees, and kappa, the worms which are in vegetables. If you would strain them out, you're not allowed to eat them. They're worms. You're not allowed to eat them. And Marror has worms in it, and you're not allowed to eat the bugs. Kevan de Paresh Memokum Revise, since these bugs have moved from where they grew, well, they are sheretz hashoretz upon sheretz hashoresh ala aretz. The Torah says that creepy crawlies, that creepeth and crawleth upon the eartheth, those are the ones you're not allowed to eat. But an insect which never did creepeth or crawleth upon the earth is not prohibited by the Torah. An insect which lays its egg in the apple, and a worm hatches from the egg and grows in the apple, and that worm lives its whole life snug and content in the apple and never did crawl upon the earth, that worm has no prohibition associated with it. You're allowed to eat it. Unlike a worm which crawled along the surface of the apple and drilled its way into the apple. Well, that worm was what was creeping along the surface of the apple. The apple is attached to the branch is attached to the tree is attached to the ground, and therefore that worm has the status of having crept upon the earth by walking along the apple while it was still growing. Oh, these worms, which are in the Marror, crept there from elsewhere and are therefore prohibited. The Tosafot, a few generations after the Rashbam on the previous screen, continue to quote Rabbeinu Hananel, V'im Tama, Tikshe Minei L'Shmuel, D'Amar B'Sof Elu Treifers. If you want to say that this whole approach is problematic because it doesn't square well with what Shmuel taught us in the Gemara, namely, Kishot, Shehit Liya Be'ivei Asa Mishum Sheretz HaShoretz Al-Adama. If you want to say that this whole thing is problematic because how do you know that those worms crawled upon the earth and bored their way into the Marror? Maybe they were there all the time. V'chi tema debodek lahu shelo yeh kappa. Well, and the whole idea of Rabbeinu Hananel is fundamentally flawed, because if there are prohibited worms in the Marror, of course, you have to check the Marror. You have to examine the Marror very carefully, remove the worms, and before you. Well, if you check the Marror very carefully and remove the worms, so why are they still problematic? Uh, uh, the whole approach of Rabbeinu Hananel is fundamentally flawed. If there are worms, then, like with any other infested vegetable, examine the vegetable carefully, remove any worms, and eat the rest of it. Well, why should it be a problem? Im kena mai tzorich harosis kevan deleka. By the time you come to, if the lettuce is infested, if the maror is infested, before Leil HaSeder, just clean it and remove the worms. What's the problem? The problem is Shema Barov Yirakot Ein Bem Kappa. Maybe the problem is that the majority of maror in the market is free of infestation. Maybe that's the problem. What on earth is he talking about? I explain. Chiyuv Bedika. Let me get that on chat typed correctly. Chiyuv Bedika, an obligation to examine, an obligation to check food for infestation. If there is an obligation to check food for infestation, the existence of that obligation prohibits eating the food. Where there is an obligation to examine food, the food is prohibited until the examination is performed, and performance of the examination then permits eating the food. Everyone knows that after shechita of cattle, the lungs have to be inspected. The thoracic cavity is opened up, the lungs are inspected. Everyone knows that. Here we have a chiyuv, an obligation to inspect the lungs. The meat of the animal, even though it's properly slaughtered, you're still not allowed to eat it until the examination is performed. Performance of the examination then permits eating the food. Now the question is, what creates an obligation to examine the food? Where did the chiyuv bedika, where did the obligation to check the food come from? And the answer to that question is fairly straightforward. There are three possible sources. There are three possible reasons why there might be a chiyuv bedika, an obligation to check food, and therefore the food is prohibited until you perform the examination. There are three possible reasons. Reason number one, there might be a rabbinic halacha midrabanan. There might be rabbinic legislation requiring the examination. That's the case with the lungs. There's a whole discussion in the Gemara which comes to the conclusion that the rabbis instituted the obligation to examine the lungs of the animals. Why did they do it? Because there are often problems. Often problem means less than 50% of the time. There are often problems, but not 50% of the time. And therefore, since not the majority of lungs are treif, therefore there's no Torah obligation to examine the lungs, it's only rabbinic. So that's one possible source of an obligation to examine rabbinic legislation, as with lungs of cattle. A second source could be chazaka. Here we have that typed correctly on chat. Presumption of infestation. What creates a presumption of infestation? If you happen to find 3 insects in the food, not 1, not 2, but 3. If you happen to find 3 insects in the food, then the chazaka, the presumption is that the food is completely infested, and you're not allowed to eat it until you do a thorough inspection. If you find 1 ant in the sugar, just remove the ant and the rest of the sugar is okay. If you find two ants in the sugar, just remove them and the rest of the sugar is fine. If you find three ants in the sugar, the presumption is that the sugar is totally infested. You're not allowed to eat any of it until you do a careful examination of all of the sugar. Okay. Um, the Tosafos teaches us the third source of an obligation to check. If a majority of what's in the market is infested, I speak about each individual item sold in the market. If the majority of lettuce is infested, if the majority of tomatoes are infested, if the majority of eggs have blood in them, if the majority of whatever we're talking about in the market has something prohibited about it, then each individual egg, each individual head of lettuce, each individual tomato has to be examined to make sure it's free of infestation if the majority is infested in the market. And the Tosfos says, well, Marror does have an infestation rate, but it's not the majority of Marror in the market. And therefore, as far as halacha is concerned, there's no obligation to inspect it. Now, of course, market conditions vary from time to time and place to place, and whether we're talking about lettuce, tomatoes, or anything else, what is and what is not majority infested varies from time to time and place to place. First, you have to establish the facts, and then you will know whether there's an obligation to check the food. The Samach Shmuel Aruba. Shmuel, of course, knew that the majority of kappa is not infested. Therefore, there was no obligation to examine it, and therefore it's quite possible that the Mora was infested, and that's why he requires the charoset to get rid, to kill the insects which might be there, but we have no obligation to go looking for them. The charosis will kill the the insects, the poisonous insects. One wonders how that helps. I mean, dead insects are just as prohibited as live insects, and probably just as poisonous. But this is a question which we're going to deal with shortly. The Meiri, one of the great medieval commentators, one of the great Rishonim, Afal pi she'ein charosis mitzvah, tzarich la'avim b'toras sakana. We have to have the charosis because without the charosis, there's some sakana, some danger in eating the maror. The Gemara explains that the danger is the kappa, these worms. That means no, it's not worms. It's the other meaning of sraf. It's the other meaning of sraf. It's the lachut. It's the moisture which oozes out of the moror, the resin which oozes out. That's the poisonous thing, and the sharpness of the charosis eliminates the noxious characteristic of the resin that oozes out of the moror. Umasha Omra Mishum Kappa, when the Gemara told us that we're concerned about Kappa, Laman Da'ama Da'ave Tolas, when those who hold that there's a worm in the Morah, they weren't worried about the prohibition of eating worms. They were worried about the danger of this specific worm because it's poisonous. If we would be concerned that the worms are prohibited, then what's it help to dip them into harosis? But it must be that if there are worms, they are permitted to be eaten because they never crept and crawled upon the earth, but they're still dangerous, and the harosis is going to get rid of it. One could speak endlessly about the different theories about the danger of Maror, but we've seen enough. Let's turn specifically to the question my mitzvah, why they thought it's so important. Up till now, we thought that the reason for the charosis, we thought it was so important. The reason we thought was because it has to do with the dangerous marror. Most recipes are sweet. The and you'll find justification for the sweetness in a moment. Rabbi Levi Omer, one of the great rabbis of the Gemara, said, the reason we have charosis is to remember apples. Apples, and that's an important part of the recipe. Apples, it's apples, which are the critical ingredient, because the charosis is supposed to remind us of apples. What on earth did he mean? Well, why do we want to remember apples? Because according to the Midrash, the pregnant women, when it came time to give birth in Egypt, they gave birth without any discomfort, which is a little bit mysterious. Exactly how that happened. That must have been some kind of miracle that they gave birth without any discomfort. You know, the humans, we are bipedal. We stand on 2 feet, which frees our hands to do things with. Um, Bipedalism is one of the great advantages of being human. It frees your hands and allows you to do things with your hands. On the other hand, bipedalism has some problems also. Uh, uh, the pelvis, the human pelvis is huge. It must support the whole torso. The whole upper body has to be supported by the by the by the pelvis, which gives humans a huge pelvis. If you look at pelvises of quadrupeds, mammals that go on 4 feet, you'll see that their pelvises are very small because the pelvises don't have to hold up the whole upper body. Their bodies are supported by 4 feet. Our whole weight is supported by 2 feet, and therefore the pelvis has to hold up the total weight of the upper body, and the pelvis has to be very large. And uh, since the pelvis has to be so large, the birth canal, which passes through the pelvis, has to be very small in order that the bone be very substantial enough to hold up the whole weight of the person. And it's the smallness, the narrowness of the birth canal passing through the human pelvis, which makes all the discomfort in childbirth. Uh, people people who suffer backaches can also blame their pelvises for that. Quadrupeds, which support their weight on 4 feet, veterinarians tell me they never heard of backaches in quadrupeds. In any event, the Mishnah asks, what is the mitzvah? Rabbi Levi says, the reason we have charosis is to remember the apples, because the women in Egypt gave birth under the apple trees, and they gave birth without any discomfort. Rabbi Yochanan says, Zeichelatit, we have the charosis in order to remember the mortar that the Jews were required to use to mortar the bricks together when they were building the pyramids or whatever in Egypt. The charosis is part of our remembering the shibud, the enslavement in Egypt. That's why we have it. And after all, if there were not a true mitzvah involved in the charosis, then the charosis would simply be a violation of Bal Tosif, of adding a new commandment to the Torah. But the charosis is not a new commandment to the Torah. It's part of the way we remember the shibud, the enslavement in Egypt, and that really is one of the 613 commandments of the Torah. Now, let's take a look at how the Shulchan Aruch Harav, this is the second time this evening I'm quoting the Shulchan Aruch Harav. Let's see what he has to say about the charosis. Achar she'achal kazayit shel matzah. First, you eat the matzah, a kazayit of matzah. And that being a Torah mitzvah, of course, you want to make sure, as well as you can, that you've covered as many opinions of the great rabbis as you can in eating matzah. So you want to eat more of that. The Marror is the Rabbanim, and not so much reason to be strict there. After the matzah, Yikach miyad kizayas Marror, take a kizayat of Marror, Yishkenu kulo, and immerse it entirely in the charoset, kedei lechamit et hakapa, in order to kill the worms. And he says flat out, there are worms in the Marror, and the charoset kills them. And since they're dead, they will not harm you. But nowadays, he wrote this in the early 18th century in Lithuania and Eastern Europe. Nowadays, nowadays we do not practice this immersion of the charosis. We do not practice the immersion of the Marror in charosis. We don't do what the Shulchan Aruch says. We do not submerge our Marror in the charosis. We just dip it a little bit. Some people square, some people justify our practice against what it says in the Shulchan Aruch. Some people explain our practice of not submerging the Marror in the charosis, because our Marror really doesn't have these worms. I mean, all these worms they talk about in the Marror, that was back in the days of the Mishnah. That was back in the days of the Gemara in the Near East, who knows what. But here in Lithuania in the 18th century, in Eastern Europe, we don't have worms like that. So the whole purpose of the charosis in killing the worms has fallen away because we don't have those poisonous worms in our Marror. The only reason we have charosis is not the old reason which applied in those days to kill the poisonous worms. The only reason we have it now is to remember the shibud, to remember the enslavement in Egypt. And there's no bracha on the charoset. It's just secondary to the Marror. And for us, the Marror, which is D'Rabbanan today, and the charosis that goes with it, all of it is D'Rabbanan, and therefore only a kiyum, a fulfillment of a different Torah mitzvah, namely the mitzvah of remembering the shibud, the enslavement in Egypt. Now, I did not have time. I'm going to quote now Vayaged Moshe, written by a rabbi in Brooklyn. His name is Rabbi Katz. I usually refrain from quoting sources which are interesting. This is an interesting source we're going to look at. I usually refrain from quoting sources aside from those of the well-known, most influential rabbis. I usually quote only the heavyweights. But I found this particular passage very interesting, and he bases himself on the heavyweights. I just didn't have time to look up the original passages and type them out. So instead of typing out the passages from the original sources, I'm just quoting the secondary source here, which I normally don't like to do, but I normally have more time to prepare things. In any event, he quotes the Rosh, the last of the great Baalei Tosafot at the end of the Middle Ages. He quotes the Tosafot, he quotes the Rosh, Regilim kol hashana she'ochlim chazeret below charotzes. All year long, we eat Marror, lettuce or whatever it is. All year long, we eat it without charosis. Only in Leil HaSeder, only on Seder night are we all of a sudden concerned with these worms and stuff. All year long, no one seems to be concerned about these poisonous worms. Now the Balatanya in the 18th century told us that we just don't have those worms anymore. Here we find the Rosh at the end of the Middle Ages, centuries earlier, pointing out, he lived in Spain, pointing out that, well, here we don't seem to have a problem with these worms either. After all year long, we're eating the vegetable without horosis. Tibor shu mitzvah hizhiru hachamim shlo b'chashash sakana. Why then do we use horosis if, according to the Gemara, it's all because of the danger, and we no longer have this danger? The Rosh didn't explain the answer to this question. But in the Sefer Mor Uktzir, written by Rav Yaakov Emden, Rav Yaakov ben Tzvi Emden, he was one of the big names in the 18th century. There were two big rabbis in Germany in the 18th century. Rav Yaakov Emden, whom we are about to quote, and his big opponent, Rabbi Yonasan Eibschitz. Those two great rabbis were at loggerheads. So hard to find anything they agreed upon. But in any event, Rav Yaakov Emden, his father's name was Tzvi, Rabbi Yaakov ben Tzvi Emden, explains as follows. This is 18th century Germany. Even though it's true that all year long there's no danger in eating maror, not all year long we don't bother with harosis. Nonetheless, gabe mitzvah ikalamechash. Nonetheless, eating maror in Leil HaSeder is a mitzvah. It's not the mitzvah of eating maror on Pesach. It's the mitzvah of remembering the shibud in Mitzrayim. It's the mitzvah of remembering the Korban Pesach, but it is a mitzvah. Tvei milakayim mitzvah hasoten mekatreg yoter. And since there is an element of mitzvah in eating the maror, namely the mitzvah of remembering the korbanot and the enslavement in Egypt, since there is an element of mitzvah, this is a situation where the Yetzer Hara will attack you. This is a situation where the Satan, and Yetzer Hara, two words for the same thing in rabbinic literature. Here, if you are guilty of any sin, and I don't know about you guys, but I'm probably guilty. I'm guilty of a few sins here and there. But being a great tzaddik myself, my sin quotient is very low, of course. But if you are somewhat sinful, then the Satan will fight against you and try to prevent you from doing mitzvahs, and therefore, in Leil HaSeder, we need extra effort to do the mitzvah. Now, bottom line, what we have learned is that according to some of the sources, we must dip the maror in harosis entirely. According to the practice which the rabbis who oppose the Shulchan Aruch teach us, it's enough just to do a little dipping, and those who are concerned about kappa, about these noxious worms, those are the ones who require complete immersion, submersing the maror in the harosis. On the other hand, those rabbis who are only concerned with remembering elements of the Beis Hamikdash and the shibud, it's enough just to do a little dipping. I want to end by mentioning the Pri Chodesh. Pri Chodesh is not only one of my favorite stories. Pri Chodesh, his name was De Silva, one of the great rabbis of 17th century Turkey, and immensely influential. The text we're going to read is printed in every standard edition of the Shulchan Aruch. And boy, oh boy, I mentioned earlier that there are examples of rabbis who disagree with the Shulchan Aruch here and there. The Pri Chodesh was, he didn't hesitate to attack the Shulchan Aruch over and over and over again. There's hardly anything he liked in the Shulchan Aruch. Masha Katav B'Orach Chaim, what it says in the Shulchan Aruch, that you should dip the maror in the charosis. Dilma la'olam emalach lo tzarich l'shkuye. Nah, this isn't. It doesn't matter. Even if you think that the charosis is supposed to kill the noxious worms, it's enough just to have the maror near the smell of the charosis. The smell alone would kill the noxious worms. You don't have to dip it for that. I don't know the hagdu shakukula, and therefore we don't bother dipping. We don't do this halacha, what it says in the Shulchan Aruch. We don't do it. We follow the Rif and the Rambam. Shish mituah. Now, it's relatively easy to focus on what the Rambam teaches us. It's relatively easy to focus on what the great rabbis taught us over the generations. It's a little bit more difficult to pay attention and to focus on what they don't say. And to notice that the Rambam and the Rif, the great Rishonim, never mention this charosis business and killing the worms. It's just not there. And we, the Pri Chodesh, the Pri Chodesh says, I follow the Rif and the Rambam, who don't mention charosis, dipping. They don't mention the whole thing anywhere. Anyway, there's no real problem with these worms. We don't have them. Masha anu meviim charosis al shulchan. We do have charosis on the table, but we don't use it for anything. We just leave it on the table in order to have a memory of the shibud, the enslavement in Egypt. So this is the most extreme opinion opposing the Shulchan Aruch, just to have it on the table and use it as a memory device. With this, I'm going to conclude a survey of some of the elements of Marror. I'm going to wish you a good week and a safe week, and eventually a Shabbat Shalom, Chodesh Tov. At least here in Israel, it's now already Rosh Chodesh. So Chag Kasher V'Sameach, and look forward to seeing you all again in the continuation of the Shiurim in the Web Yeshiva. Until then.
Thank you so much, Rabbi.
Chodesh Tov.
Have a
Sure.
wonderful
Tov, thank you very much.
Same to you.
Thank you
you.
so much.
You're
Thank
very
you,
welcome.
Rabbi. Chodesh
I-
Tov.
You're welcome.
I do
And
have one
Baruch
question
Hashem.
about the.
Yes, Rebecca, yes?
Yeah, so here's my question. So one of the reasons we know Marror is supposedly is because Marror was widely eaten in Egypt, and we see it like there's archaeological evidence everywhere that they had the leaves of romaine lettuce. So didn't they know that there were people who were eating romaine lettuce and not dying because they weren't using charosis? This is what confuses me here.
Indeed, as the Roche points out, we eat it all year. Back then, too, they ate it all year long without the charosis.
So that's probably, okay. So it just goes into that. Okay. I guess Babel is also far from Egypt.
Very good.
Thank you.
Okay, be well, be well. Chag Kasher V'Sameach.
Chag Kasher V'Sameach and Chodesh Tov.
Shalom.